I could have warned Matt Hancock not to give Isabel Oakeshott his phone for reasons I don't have time to go into. I certainly wouldn't have handed her my phone. Advice I proffer free of charge to Mr. Richard Tice. If you know, you know. But as the co-author of Hancock's recent apologia, time to surf on his appearance in celebrity television in I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, Matt Hancock is well and truly in the jungle now, tied to a tree and with several vipers descending upon him. Presumably, in the course of their research for the book, Isabel Oakeshott obtained access one way or another to a set of WhatsApp messages which have now written themselves into the history books. It's probably the first time WhatsApp has made it into the history books. But the messages that are uncovered, unveiled, between Matt Hancock, Boris Johnson, the chiefs of the medical and scientific apparatus in the British state, other ministers, senior members of Parliament, are so utterly damning that you certainly haven't heard the last of them. They will, of course, feature prominently in the public inquiry, which I've no idea when it will get underway or for how many years it will toil, but the vineyard will be full of Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages. Many things are revealed in these messages. The first is the state of absolute chaos which prevailed at the top of the British state. And now that we can see them, we can more easily understand how our country was amongst the worst in the entire world. Despite all the efforts to spin Boris Johnson's government as somehow a success on COVID, we were a catastrophic failure. Not only did a very significant number of our people die, particularly old people who were sent into the canyons of horror, otherwise known as old people's homes, to make way in the hospitals for the expected tsunami of COVID victims. They were sent into these old people's homes not just to die themselves, but to pass the virus on to others and kill them, staff as well as old people that were living in these residences. The crime, of course, does not end there. The crime of failure to prepare is one that the government and the opposition will completely fail to exculpate themselves from. I'm going to say something about the opposition here because it's very important that it's not just the government that is the scapegoat tied to the stake to be sacrificed. It's even very important, more important, that it's not just Matt Hancock who is the sacrificial lamb. It's vital to know that at a moment of great national trial, both the government and the opposition parties, and because he's the leader of the opposition, at Keir Starmer's door must lie the indictment that the British state failed and its opposition, its political system failed to hold the government properly to account, to question vastly expensive measures and decisions that were taken that cost not just lives but almost uncountable treasure. The opposition played the role of supporting the government every step of the way, except where the opposition were egging the government on to go even further down a road that now looks disastrously misconceived. Many things are revealed in the exchanges that are published in the Daily Telegraph, which, of course, is the publisher of choice for stolen material. Not so long ago, they were the publisher of the MP's expenses, which sent several members of Parliament to prison and which utterly transformed the landscape of the British people's faith or otherwise in their parliamentary representatives. So although the Daily Telegraph is far from my paper, I take my hat off to them for both of these publications of stolen material. It's a pity they cannot see their way to adding their voice to the demands for the release from Belmarsh of the world historic publisher of the Julian Assange of WikiLeaks, the man who broke more stories than any other journalist in history. He was publishing stolen material, just like the Daily Telegraph did. And in all three cases, they were doing the public a service. The public interest defense in having done so is simply insurmountable, unbeatable. But one of the things that struck me as the father of young children who were marooned for more than 1 year of their young lives was the absolute clarity in the WhatsApp exchanges that putting masks on school children was not only not necessary, was not only useless, but was merely a piece of party political propaganda. It's exposed there, where Boris Johnson concedes that the children don't need these masks, but Nicola Sturgeon, the erstwhile First Minister of Scotland, is putting masks on her children, so we had better do so too to avoid a political rumpus with her. How shameful is that? Revealed also, and in the same vein, the rule of 4, the rule of 6, turns out to be scientific bunkum and was known to be bonkers by the high Hedians in the scientific and medical establishment and by the government ministers who were mandating it. That's important for me because our children were thereby precluded from playing football, from all extracurricular activities for more than 1 year on an entirely bogus prospectus, unnecessary and merely a political artifice. We haven't yet got to the issue of the vaccine, another of the trumpeted achievements of Boris Johnson. But if it is anything like the damning revelations of the early part of the crisis over COVID-19, well, it ought to lead to the imprisonment, certainly the trial of British government ministers and scientific and medical observers, advisors, the people who sat on the MIC, the medical industrial complex, who dragged us down a road that we didn't need to go and from which we may never recover. Not just the psychological trauma for so many of our people, made to suffer when politicians were doing the precise opposite. People were not allowed to sit next to their grieving mothers when their father was in a coffin in a funeral parlor. People were not allowed, even the Queen had to sit alone at the funeral of her late husband. The trauma that was visited on people who were not allowed to touch their dying family members, or who were done up like spacemen in medical wards trying to communicate with dreadfully ill members of their own family, whether children to speak to their parents or parents to speak to their children. The trauma of having your operation postponed indefinitely because of the failure of the government to prepare for a pandemic. The trauma of medical staff who were faced with millions of people of whom the pants had been scared. One of the many damning WhatsApp messages is a discussion in which Matt Hancock discusses with his colleagues when they were, I'm quoting, when they were going to deploy the new variant maneuver. to scare the pants off the public. Now, of course, that was not a zero-cost scare. That scaring, terrorizing, terrifying the British population by their own government was costly indeed to the mental health of the people, to the whole way of life of the people in this country. But of course, now that it's revealed, who now will believe any other message that comes from our government, that comes from the top echelons of the civil service? Not me, that is for sure. I myself deeply regret the extent to which I did believe them. I feel embarrassed, humiliated by the extent to which I did believe them. I'll never believe them again, will you? Now that we know that the vaccine was not as sold, now that we know that the virus was not the deadly catastrophe that we were told that it was, now that we know that masks were useless, now that we know that the rule of 4, the rule of 6, no sport, no walking in the park. You could walk in the park, but if you sat down for a rest on the bench, you'd get arrested. All of it now looks utterly ludicrous, absurd, and it is indeed a shame that so many of us went along with it. And I owe an apology to some of those, not all, but to some of those I, in effect, traduced for their skepticism. I would have been better being more skeptical myself. More of that, I'm sure, later. As you've heard me say before, the terrorist atrocity in the Manchester arena in 2017 was a matter of great importance to me. I was less than 1 mile away when the explosion occurred. I was myself in the environs of the arena as the scale of the catastrophe unrolled. And moreover, I had seen this coming. I had seen the gathering in the great city of Manchester of a group of people, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. The clue was in the name. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group were deliberately concentrated in the city of Manchester by successive British governments and their organs of the deep state, one of which, MI5, has decided or been decided for them that they must take the rap for the mass murder of 23 people by a person whose name I shall not utter. Such scum, filth is he. I try not to mention his name, but I knew the community from which he sprang. And I knew that they had been deliberately concentrated there as an Islamic fighting group for future use against Gaddafi in Libya when the other organs of the British state decided that that was the right thing to do. The inquiry into events now more than 5 years ago has finally landed, and nobody paid it any attention at all. It's scarcely featured in the news and political landscape. Of course, MI5 made ghastly mistakes, mainly of failure to communicate with the police the kind of intelligence about the family of the mass murderer that they were in possession of. But MI5 are not the main culprits here. The main culprits are MI6, whose decision to use this group of head-chopping, throat-cutting, heart-eating, Islamist fanatic extremists in an English city as a kind of reserve army, a cell, a fighting cell in a great city in the north of England, must take far more of the responsibility. And the prime ministers who oversaw that policy. Starting with Gordon Brown, that paragon of virtue, as he now struts around calling for other people to be put on trial for war crimes, whilst being co-responsible for the biggest war crime of the century, the invasion and occupation of Iraq. He's the joint defendant in a future trial, either here or on the judgment day. He was the man who began the descent to the disaster that exploded amongst all those innocent children in the Manchester arena. And his predecessors played a big role also. And did his successors. I'm talking about David Cameron, the man who appeared on a balcony hailing the arrival of democracy after the brutal murder and sodomy of the Libyan leader Colonel Gaddafi, the man who, with little Sarkozy, now in prison or awaiting prison for corruption in connection to Libyan gold and treasure, David Cameron shares responsibility, as does Theresa May, who gave them their passports. Gave them their passports so that they could come and go to a war in Libya where they learned the deadly skills with which they murdered all of our children in the Manchester arena. The Royal Navy rescued the mass murderer himself and sailed him back to England, later to wreak such havoc and tragedy on the families of the 23 people who perished. There's so much more that I'd like to say, but time is against me. It is the mother of all talk shows. That I can promise you. Stay tuned.